What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update of sorts to No Rest for the Wicked, a sort of isometric Souls-like endeavor that released into early access back in April. And if you were following my channel or anyone else's about the game at that time, the general consensus was that it's very good, but at the moment it was very unpolished. So taking in a lot of that feedback, Moon Studios spent its first bit of early access simply polishing up and fixing a lot of those problems. And while I still see reports on that front, on the negative side I will very generally say that this time around the game ran much smoother for me personally, and wasn't constantly crashing on me, which was always good. And much of the early game updates were simply focused around that. Tons of fixes, tons of little quality of life improvements based on feedback. But just about a week or so ago, No Rest for the Wicked saw its first major content update, as they're finally shifting gears from fixing things to actually expanding content available in the early access period. And that kicks us off with the Crucible update, which is a big expansion of something that was already in the game called the Serum Crucible, which is effectively like a roguelite mode for when you're looking for more and more content outside of the more scripted stuff. Now that comes with its own features, of course, but there were also a few other things added via the update as well. For starters, we got a new tier of gear called Exalted Gear, which goes along with the Crucible as well, and a new sort of NPC vendor called the Seneschal. But they've also expanded and extended regions outside of this Crucible area and just kind of the open world that you can explore. Specifically, they've added and expanded onto the areas of the Black Trench and the Nameless Pass. So if you go back to those places, you should see more now. They also added some visual stuff for combat. Enemies can freeze, shatter, burst into flames, be dismembered, etc. now, as they look to make the already pretty satisfying combat even more impressive. And what's more, just kind of as a random note, they added stray animals to the game so you can interact with those as well now. Unsurprisingly, they've also continued with this patch to add fixes and updates to the game's performance side of things. In particular, there was a big focus on CPU performance, memory optimization, and touching up cinematics to make sure that they're all rendering as efficiently as possible. But while that's all well and good, let's actually talk about the major update, the Crucible. Now again, this was in the game, this is simply an expanded version of it. But the way the Crucible works is that after a short introductory quest, when you get to the main town, after the sort of intro to what you're about to experience and everything, you can encounter the Crucible under the cemetery, which is an old training ground for people like you, the Serum, the people who are trained to fight the plague that's infesting the land and causing all sorts of problems. Now before, this was a set of randomized rooms that allowed you to fight enemies in a sort of roguelite way, across various different runs of course. Now with this update, they've tripled the amount of content that you'll potentially run into here in the Crucible, but they've also added a few other things, such as a clear art direction including an enemy faction, the vendor, the Seneschal, and echoes. Now echoes are the more traditional roguelite thing you would expect from basically any roguelite thing. As you defeat enemies rather than experience in this mode, you pick up these echoes, and you can then spend them on these huge buffs to your gameplay style, and as you either re-roll them or buy them, they'll get replaced with other effects, and you can sort of stack these up as you go about clearing all of these different rooms, which should, in theory, provide a convenient place to test out some of what is possible build-wise without having to entirely dedicate your character to a specific build. Now on that note, it's probably worth a mention that one of the quality of life features that's been added since launch is the ability to respec, but this should allow you to experiment with basically just what's possible. And given the sort of lack of more scripted content out in the rest of the game at the moment, mostly due to its early access state, I'd say that's a pretty welcome feature. But along with the Crucible comes the Seneschal. So as we participate in the Crucible events, we can also find Gloam Seed. We're going to turn this into the Seneschal, who is going to use it to do things that we want, such as the exalting of our weapons, Fallen Embers, which allow the respec, resources for things like the building and stuff in town, and even just unlocking more features in the Crucible itself. Now when it comes to the Gloam Seed specifically, probably worth mentioning that the new enemy faction that was added is called the Gloam. Right now they are confined to the Crucible, but later on they will be added to the broader world. Ultimately though, the Gloam are simply another type of being corrupted by the pestilence or the plague that is ravaging the land, so you can expect that as well. Putting all of that together to make a more cohesive conclusion to the video here, I will say that in the roughly 4 months since the game's early access launch, the vast majority of what they've done is simply fix bugs and improve performance, with smaller side things like improving quality of life as well as little additions to things like gear, etc., making up the bulk of content that they've added. So the Crucible marks the biggest addition yet. Now, while I can see why they want the Crucible in there to, again, provide that essentially roguelite mode, which is enough to be a full game on its own for plenty of other instances of video games, it's simply going to be one feature among the crowd in the final version of this game. So, on one hand, I can appreciate that it gives someone something to do besides simply continue to run around the world once you've run out of scripted things to do. I will also say that a roguelite mode isn't exactly the most exciting content update in the world, especially when so much of the base game has this really compelling narrative and everything, and I'm much more interested in seeing that get expanded, as well as the planned additions of things like co-op and PvP, but nonetheless, I think this is an important step in the right direction because now they're focused on actually adding content rather than just fixing things. So, long story short on this one, the game's been improving, performance is already much better, and I really think this one is on track to be a tremendous game when it launches fully. If you would like more updates like this one, or you're looking forward to my inevitable review on release for this one, then by all means subscribe and stick around. But let me know what you think about all this down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, and subscribe. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.